I'd like to start by thanking you guys for listening to so many amazing speeches today, and I'm hoping that this as a culmination will inspire a little bit of debate. I'll keep it brief, but I want to talk to you today about disasters and how we respond to them and why we need to change the way that we respond to droughts, floods, cyclones. We're all familiar with the images on our screen from mega emergencies, Japan earthquake, tsunami, Pakistan floods, Haiti last year. And we're in the Horn of Africa, where we sometimes become desensitized to words like drought or famine. In fact, there are 9 million people in need of food assistance in the Horn of Africa now, across Ethiopia, Djibouti, Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. And a slowly evolving regional hunger crisis can actually have equally devastating impacts at some of these mega emergencies. But you won't see them on your television screen for another 4 weeks, if at all. And the reason is because the way the system works now. Droughts, floods, and cyclones are among the biggest threats to food insecure populations on the continent. The UN World Food Program, which handles 80% of emergency multilateral food assistance in the world, spends, on average, every year, $1 billion in Africa. Now, half of that is related to conflict, but the other half is related to the weather. And we have, the good news is, really great technologies to be able to monitor and predict the weather. So there's no reason that we can't get assistance to a farmer like this in time. Now, let's go over a little bit about the way it works now. We have an event, which is, in this case, a harvest event, where there's a shortage. Government experts and external technical experts from different UN agencies and other countries come in, and they conduct what's a needs assessment and come to agreement on the number of people affected and the potential cost of assistance. We then launch an appeal to the international community, followed by what we often refer to as the CNN effect, and that's when you see the images on your screens. Now, those images compromise the dignity of the people on the screen, but they're very effective in securing funding. Now, this process takes 8 to 10 weeks, best case scenario. What happens in those 8 to 10 weeks? Well, we lose lives. If you're a little bit more resilient, you begin selling off your oxen. That's a productive asset, allows you to farm. You leave your land, you take your children out of school. And all of the development gains that we've achieved since the last drought are reversed. And we're back to square one. And then there's a response. So how do we close the gap between the harvest time and the response? How do we move that funding arrow back so that we have resources available before a season ends, or when there's a necessary response, and then we can invest in preventative responses. And the good news is there's a really great way to do that, and we can estimate the number of people that might be affected using predictive weather models. And we develop what we call a drought index. So what we're going to see is how we can organize information to package it in a way that decision makers can understand it and use it to respond more efficiently. So this particular presentation will talk about how we move that funding arrow back. So the first step is quantifying the risk. And that means coming up with a number of people affected and a dollar amount. There are 3 elements to risk. One of them, the first is the hazard. Well, the hazard here is the weather. And what is the information that we actually have about weather? We have 261,000 satellite pixels that cover the continent of Africa, which is very exciting and cool. And they're about 10 by 10 kilometers squared. And every 10 days, there's a satellite that feeds us information about the rainfall in every single one of those pixels. But we don't really care if it rains in a place or it doesn't rain in a place where people don't live. Some people might care. But for this purpose, for food insecure populations, we want to know how does that affect the rangeland, how does it affect the crops that are grown, who's living there, how at risk are they. And the World Food Program actually houses a really large repository of data about who's vulnerable and where they are, and how much in today's procurement and logistics costs it takes to assist one person in Ethiopia or Sudan or Kenya. So we have these three elements of risk: hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And we realized that there's actually a lot of people who have been working in all of these fields for a really long time. They're meteorologists or vulnerability experts, but they don't talk to each other. And so we said, is there a way we can get this data to work together? And we literally said, maybe we should just GIS map it and layer these pictures on top of each other so that we can see from the top layer, is there something happening, and can we respond to it? So we take the best of breed technologies and methods from early warning and crop monitoring, vulnerability assessment mapping, humanitarian operational response, and financial planning and risk management, and see what we can do with it. Well, 261,000 pixels or more is a lot of calculations. And so for each one of those pixels, we layer information through a software that's called Africa Risk View. And when I say we, it's the Climate and Disaster Risk Solutions team at the World Food Program that developed this software. So we take, again, the rainfall, which is our hazard. We convert that into a meaningful indicator, the drought index. We come up with an estimated number of people affected, and then finally, the cost of assistance. So here's the product that we come out with. So this is the first picture, is the hazard. And that's a rainfall map where the darker blue areas are where it rained a lot, lighter blue areas are where it didn't rain very much. And sometimes, people live in areas where it doesn't rain very much anyway. So we compare that to the average over the past 15 years. And you can see the red and orange areas in the bottom map are areas where there could be problems. But we still don't know how is that affecting what's grown in the area or the rangeland. So then we layer on top of that a crop mask. And what we see is in the areas that are yellow or lighter green, the crops that are grown there got less than the 50% of the water that they require for a successful harvest. But sometimes we're planting the wrong thing in the wrong place. So let's compare that to the average. And then what emerges is where the crops have done really poorly in the red and orange areas. And this is from the end of season 2010. Now, again, we want to see the vulnerability layer. So who lives where? What are they growing? And how many people will be affected? So for every first-level administrative district in sub-Saharan Africa, we know the population, we know the percentage subject to mild, medium, or severe drought. And we can then estimate for all of Africa how many people were potentially affected by the weather that year. And it's updated every 10 days. So what you see here is from 1996 through 2010, the end of season totals of the number of people affected. And this correlates at 91% to the last 150 WFP operations. The last bar is dark blue and light blue. The dark blue is how many people are already affected at the end of the 7 rainfall seasons of sub-Saharan Africa. And then the light blue is the remaining seasons, how many we could potentially have. This graph doesn't really help a finance minister either, who needs to release resources in time to be able to respond. So we give him or her a funding graph. And at the end, you see the last 15 years of data. You could spend as little as what you did in the lowest gray line, or you could spend as high as this blue line that goes across the graph. And that is called the cone of uncertainty. This cone shrinks as we update it with regular data. So every time a satellite reading comes in, every 10 days, it runs through the calculations of who lives, how did it affect the crops, who lives there, how many people are potentially in need, how does that affect the cost of assistance, and we get something that looks more like this, where we can see, okay, by the end of the year, I know that I'm going to need at least where this lower gray line is. I could need, based on the average year, up to that red, and I could need even my worst possible scenario, which is a 1 in 100 worst case drought year, which is the dotted line that goes off the top. And by the end of the season, that spread shortens. Now, with this information, each country could put aside a reserve account. And we could say, okay, we can put aside 200 million for Ethiopia. We'll be ready whenever there's a really severe drought. 200 million for Malawi, 150 for Kenya. And when you add all of those up, you get to a $6 billion figure, or over $6 billion. And that's where the top of the blue line is. That's a cumulative amount that you would need to address drought in Africa if you were to put into a bank account for each individual country what you need. Now, droughts are not happening at the same time in the same place in the same year, so why would we tie all that money up? And so we said, okay, well, let's do some simulations on this. What happens when we pool the risk across the continent and we diversify our portfolio? And what you get is the red. And so the more countries that participate in a risk pooling entity allows more countries to save money. So what we have is you can, if you were to pool all of the risk in Africa, you can cut the cost of contingent capital in half, which means you only need $3 billion. That still sounds like a lot of money. But once you think about reinsurance markets, you can certainly leverage that to 1 in 10, 1 in 13. So what's exciting about this is that the African Union decided they would like to pursue it. And so the African Union is leading a project called the African Risk Capacity, and the ARC would provide participating member states with immediate resources in the event of a natural disaster. And what does that do? Does one, it transfers the ownership away from the international aid community that has been traditionally late in responding to African governments with defined contingency plans in place so that they can implement what they need to when it's needed. And the second thing it does is it transfers the risk that has been shouldered by the most vulnerable populations to international financial markets who can handle it a lot better. And there's a lot of information on this map, which covers about 1 billion people in the world. But if we can make this work for Africa, then there's a lot that Africa can teach the world. Finally, I will leave you with an image that you will not see on your television screens. It's a man checking the weather gauge because he's going to be prepared before the crisis happens. And this is from southwestern Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian government actually piloted this 6 years ago. And we're only expanding to the rest of Africa because we had already developed a prototype with the Ethiopian government 6 years ago, and we knew it could be done. So now they have a drought index model that releases $160 million to scale up productive safety net programs in the north, in particular, or around the country actually, with the World Bank. That is based on a trigger. So they have resources in place, and they've already redrawn their timeline for disaster response. And if Ethiopia can do it, then we can do it all over Africa. And if Africa can do it, we can do it all over the world. So I hope that this really replaces your images of a 1984 drought. And this is the image that takes us from managing crises to really managing our risks a little bit better. Thanks.